So, hello everybody. Oh, Martin's just adjusting the light fitments there. Yes, hello everybody.
Good evening.
We provide the best lighting on this show. I mean, I've got the covers down so my face is not in the glare, but we'll do the usual test, which is, can everybody hear me? So, hello Gunnar, hello Barry, welcome. Can you hear me? So we'll just... We need some like music at this point. Sort of just playing people while we wait. Nobody said they can't hear me. Yes! Everybody's listening. Thank you for confirming. So welcome everybody. I hope you're having a good evening, and I'm very pleased to welcome Martyn Pring on the show. Martyn, welcome. Just
Thank you.
tell the masses everything, well, not everything about you, but about you and what your background is.
Well, my marketing is essentially my background is essentially marketing over many years. 2003 onwards, I moved into the tourism sector and also into the academic sector as well. Working at Bournemouth University on 3 separate occasions over the years. And literally over the last 4 years, I've evolved this series of books looking at the concept of luxury deluxe railway travel. First book was out last year. Second book due out end of October this year, which is very much a continuation of the theme, but looking at things from exploring how people travel to France, the continent, and the Channel Islands, as well as the interrelationship with how people travelled with ocean liners and ocean steamers from the late sort of second half of the 19th century. So very much a case of that. But centred around the notion of the boat trade, which is a slightly different way of looking at things.
Cool. Well, thank you. I think the important thing, I'm afraid I'm on the tea, but Martyn, what are you drinking tonight? What's your tipple?
Well, my tipple is half a glass of the local cider, which is produced on a farm just up the road from me, about a mile and a half away. But the same public house where I frequent, they serve this wonderful beer called Hattie Brown's Moonlight, which is absolutely superb. And it's one of these beers that translates very well from the barrel into the bottle. And likewise, my other favourite tipple from Dorset is Palmer's Golden Ale, which you get further in the west.
I do like a pint of Palmer's, and I will say that one. I don't know. I was supposed to say that about a senior academic who might be doing tours around Palmer's years ago, but never mind. But yeah, it's great. So we've got all these little breweries, but I know what you mean about some beers not translating. Some of them just don't translate well to bottle. But I'm glad they've got it right.
Some of them can be very challenging, to say the least. But people like Palmer's and Hall and Woodhouse, and the 2 major brewers in the county here in Dorset. They've had a couple of 100 years' experience of getting it right. So well done to them.
Well, absolutely. So, should we crack on? So, Martyn, I'm going to move to the first slide. So, there is the cover of your book and the book background.
Well, it's an interesting one. I mean, I've always been very interested in deluxe railway travel and the Pullman and various things ever since I was a small lad. Actually, one of the things I remember from childhood memories, very much so, was Mum telling me how she would go to visit my father. My dad was putting in. He was a merchant navy officer. He was putting an awful amount of sea time in at the time, trying to get his master's ticket. So Mum was very fortunate that she could travel first class, and she sort of went all around the country, to Liverpool, to Glasgow, Newcastle, all these places where these cargo liners were coming into. So that was, I remember Mum very much telling stories about that. I was very much fascinated by my Hornby 00 train set in the 60s and trying, so I kind of brought up on this interesting idea of Pullman carriages, deluxe travel, etc. And it sort of just continued through the interest throughout my career. And I think basically as a result of doing some research in culinary tourism around 2013, 2014, 2015, we started looking at the luxury sector in more of a systematic way, and it sort of took the opportunity putting everything in one basket, and hence the idea of writing the story of deluxe travel, railway travel in Britain. So that's how it sort of came about. From a academic stroke book perspective, it's an area that hadn't been done before, so it was a bit of a research gap. And I think more importantly, as I started to unravel the story behind this, there were lots of connected sort of disciplines, and particularly it was very much, I guess, really a combination of railway, social and travel history narratives, which started forming the whole story behind this.
Yeah, as you say there, it's important to recognise that this is not just about the railway history is social history, railway history is business history, it's economic history, it's cultural history.
Yeah. And how each individual railway company responded to this, to the opportunities that were presented over the years. Fascinating area.
Would you like me to move on to the next one?
Yes, indeed. Absolutely. I thought it would be useful just to put a sort of current context to where we are. Without a shadow of doubt, the luxury deluxe slow travel train sector is one of the most engaging aspects of the destination marketing and travel tourism sector. Very much over the past 40 years, really, since James Sherwood's initial exploration with the British Pullman and the early days of the VSOE in the 1980s, it's developed very much into a global industry phenomenon, and it's fascinating. The British role, the British combination, the way that British companies have become trailblazers very much in developing this. I think likewise, because railways were very much the cradle of the railways was very much in this country. We have unique touch points, customer experience and touch points in this country because of our very expansive heritage railway sector. And this in many ways has fueled the position to where we are now.
I mean, it's and also, I mean, it's, when a lot of when we think of luxury travel, a lot of them historically start in London in some ways, like the Orient Express, don't they?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, the British Pullman was up until the creation of the Channel Tunnel. I mean, the VSOE trip basically started in London and to Folkestone, the boat train across the Channel, and then continue into Paris thereafter, and lots of other different destinations that were developed by Belmont over the years. So yes, very much London has been central to the capital has been very much central to the development of this sector in many ways.
You'll have to. Would you like me to go on to the next one, or you'll have to nod when
yes,
you want?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Absolutely. I think one of the very interesting aspects is that rail travel, particularly the luxury rail travel, is quite multi-generational. And I think if you speak to anyone in the heritage sector, they recognise this particular aspects that, grandparents, parents, children form part of the unique customer base. And this transcends itself very much into the luxury sector. And very much so on the, I suppose, many of the rail travel companies who are putting on tours and etc. in this country. And many people are dipping into that as a way of finding their foothold into that. And in many ways that the market has been stimulated by what I describe as probably people like myself, the early silver surfers, who probably just about remember steam days. And many of these things, where people can create their experiences and remember the past, is very fortunate for the development of this particular sector. And I think, obviously, as a consequence of that, having this very, very pronounced heritage railway sector and the railway history in this country, also in Europe and the United States, it's stimulated these countries as the biggest source markets for luxury rail travel per se, really.
Something I'm sort of always musing on is, do you think like the heritage railway sector is, because in Britain we've got, I don't know exact number, I'm sure one of the audience might be able to tell us, but we've got an awful lot comparative with other nations. Do you think there's something particular in Britain?
Well, there seems to be a particular interest in almost resurrecting any possible line that is possible, really, at the moment. Whether we're getting to the point of overkill, I honestly don't know, and that's certainly something that's been discussed in heritage circles. Whether it's sustainable in the longer term, I really don't know, actually. But certainly some of the key lines on my own backyard here, the Swanage Railway, West Somerset, Bluebell, etc., Watercress lines, they've all developed in southern England into major heritage attractions, and where a lot of the local tourism sector is built in. They become signature key anchors towards development of county tourism offers, really.
Yes, and we're seeing that in the current issue, because when the Heritage Railway goes down, local businesses suffer as well, when it stops operating.
Yes, absolutely, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Right.
So, next one, shall we?
So we had a conversation. We thought there's so much to talk about. Let's focus on the pre-grouping era, because I think it's one of the interesting aspects about this is that certainly by Edwardian times, railways were one of the country's leading industries. Locomotive carriage, freight vehicle construction, basically railway building expertise, operational technologies were being exported all around the globe. And I think in the second half of the Victorian era, we saw massive transformations in the way railways developed, the number of railway companies and the routes they created. Basically, certainly by the 1890s, we had a decade of rapid and bewildering change as science and technology transformed Britain, giving rise, I guess, to the country's then role as a superpower. So I think one of the key aspects about all this is that a lot of the so-called myths around luxury railway travel and deluxe railway travel, people tried to pinhole very much on the interwar years, but I think it was very much so by certainly the last decade of the 1800s. It was very, very possible to pinpoint a luxury travel industry through a whole variety of things. Yeah. So very much a case of let's dispel the myth and
let's look at what was developing in the basically, I guess, from the 1870s onwards, really.
Yes, I mean, oh, sorry, Martin.
No, I was just saying that I think the 1870s were one of the points in time where luxury rail travel was beginning to gain a foothold. Certainly, I guess from the 1860s onwards, 1862, when the West Coast Line and the East Coast Line went on the Anglo-Scottish Expresses. They were pretty primitive carriages in those days, and the experience was pretty very, very much primitive. But I guess from the 1870s onwards, there we started to see several developments that talked about the expansion of the sector in many ways, and in providing a much better travelling experience. I don't think it was something that happened overnight, but there's certainly a number of different points in time which you build into the overall equation, which starts to you can see a natural, gradual transition over the best part of 30, 40 years up into the First World War.
So because for me, something I've always been kind of fascinated about is the Midland changes of the mid 1870s, and that in some sense could be argued is a response to the Midland opening and the settled to Carlisle and the main line to St Pancras and having to compete with those other routes, but also it sort of there, and it goes back to what we were saying about sort of it being social history. It's trading off a sort of growth in people's interest, and they've got more money in their pocket. So, what significance would you give to that decision by Allport in the mid 1870s?
Well, I think that was very, very instrumental in giving the luxury sector a very important kickstart. To be perfectly honest. Up until that time, I mean, if you took the example of the GNR on the East Coast Line, they were running very primitive 4- and 6-wheeled carriage stock, which were not particularly good travelling experiences, really, up until the first half of the 1880s, and they never responded until they were pushed, really. And I think it was the likes of Midland that kick-started that very, very much so, by bringing the flat car packs in from Pullman, creating the dining car trains, first of the sleepers, and by 1882, Midland had introduced first-class dining cars onto the central routes on the Anglo-Scottish sleepers and daytime trains. So, yeah, very, very, very much so that I think the Midland Railway were very much the trailblazers at the time, and various other companies picked up on it to some or greater extent.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So I'm going to head to the next one. So we're still, yeah.
I think railways were a key level of industrial expansion, which altered the Victorian world forever. I guess one of the big questions is, how did this all evolve, really, in many ways? Given that the aristocracy in Britain were a relatively narrow cohort, even by the end of the 19th century, the aristocratic members of society only numbered about 40,000 people, actually. So in terms of numbers, they weren't many. But one of the great interesting things about it is that over the sort of mid-19th century and onwards, many of the aristocracy became what you would describe as landed businessmen, and they were very much in the wealth creation aspects. And as a result of owning large swathes of land on which mineral rights and coal, etc., were being exploited, and railway routes were being developed, they become extremely wealthy. And in turn, this led to a greater ability of a rather larger number of people who were able to explore and see the world at greater large. So there was that aspect about it. Also, I think there was a gradual ascendancy of a new commercial and a new industrial wealth amongst what is really the upper middle classes. And they were very much the revolution creators of wealth, which really fueled the expansion of better ways to travel in many ways. And linked to this, there was this continual idea that it sucked in a whole series of other people who were gradually associated with the industrialization, professionalization of society in Britain as a whole. And as a result of that, the numbers who were able to travel either by leisure or business or a combination of both created a far greater number of people who were able to do so. And as a result, we had basically a wider expansion of the leisure classes, really, to be quite honest.
Do you think there's a sort of something I've noticed, because I mean we've talked about sort of we have quite overlapping interests. One of the things I've noticed is that, or I've suspected, and I would like to sort of think about this a bit more, is that there is almost a geographical dimension to this, in that it's London. There's different sort of strategies for London than there would be other places in the nation. I wonder if you had any thoughts, ideas on that, because I think, yeah,
obviously London was central to the whole development of many things connected to deluxe railway travel and first-class railway travel as a whole. But I think it was the railway companies and the routes they operated from the capital. In looking at the synthesis of the way this seemed to travel, I split the book up into four central routes, basically the Anglo-Scottish developments, East and West Coast Line, the Midland Railway Central Line, the routes to the West Country particularly, Wales to a lesser extent, of course, but certainly the Great Western Railway's expansion into Devon and Cornwall, and likewise the London South Western Railway, their development in taking the routes from Waterloo through to Salisbury, Exeter, and particularly into North Cornwall were key. Also around that, you had what I described as developments of first-class resorts taking place as well, which was very, very much based around, I think, around the development of Brighton, London by sea. So very, very much so in the second half of the 19th century. And likewise, a little bit later, was development of Bournemouth. By the turn of the 20th century, Bournemouth had developed into the third largest leisure transport sector in the country. So it was a place of very significantly on the map by that stage, and certainly London South Western Railway by that stage had really picked up the mantle and was pushing that very, very hard.
Yes, I think so. I will declare an interest in, or
yes,
in the London South Western Railway. I think Bournemouth is, in large part, the creation of the South Western Railway, if nothing else, by the way it connected to it and then actively stimulated that trade and traffic. Yeah. So we've got a question from Gunnar. Was it the trains, new engineering, or facilitated in pursuit of hunting, badminton line, or grouse shooting? So I mean, I would say it's quite hard to disentangle the different influences at times. It's a combination of things going on, isn't it?
Yeah, very, very, very much so. Certainly, I guess from the second half of the 19th century, the Scottish Highlands became very, very, very much in vogue. The Balmoral effect with Queen Victoria placed the Scottish Highlands very, very much on the tourism vista in a way that it had never done before. And the hunting, shooting and fishing sector, country estates very, very much prospered on the back of the royal interest in this whole area. Certainly, all three of the major Anglo-Scottish railway routes, the various companies, the consortia behind that, were absolutely instrumental in fashioning and maximising the opportunities that were present at that time, not just amongst a British indigenous market as such, but increasingly from the end of the American Civil War onwards, a very significant increase in the level of American tourists coming to Britain and to the continent. Very, very much wrapped up around what was happening in Scotland, the Lake District, combinations of a lot of travel writing at that time put these places well and truly on the map.
Yeah.
And it was very much a must-do series of destinations.
It's very interesting, sort of, you note about the sort of the royal effect. I mean, in my work on North Wales, I found that they like to cite certain places where certain luminaries had, the London North Western, like to cite that certain people had been here. They call the area around Stratford in Shakespeare's country. So they're using these individuals and people to sell a sort of idea at times, like you could go where these people have been, or this has a sort of very rooted sense of history related to a very important individual.
Yeah, very much so. I think literary tourism development is very much rooted in the late Victorian period and all the writings that were particularly well shown, and certainly, you know, many American visitors were very au fait with the writings. British writings, and they wanted to see where these landscapes had evolved, and translating the written word into the real world. And the railway companies were very much on the cusp of leading that sort of forward invasion, if you want to call it that.
Yes, I think the North Western had an office in New York, if I recall correctly. So yeah. Should we head on to the next one?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, absolutely.
We've touched on some of this already. Have we covered that one?
Yeah, I guess we have in many ways. Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think the key thing was there was a certain, I guess, towards the end of the Victorian period, there was a certain swagger about many people who were quite affluent at the time. Certainly the 1890s marked a period of decadence. Certainly interest in arts, popular culture, and the written word transformed the landscape, and certainly demand for luxury products and services very much so. So yeah, very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Let's move on again.
Yeah.
In many ways, that this idea of travel became deeply embedded, I think, certainly from the 1870s onwards, both in Britain and people from the continent coming to this country. We mustn't disregard the numbers of people coming from Germany, from France, etc., were quite significant as well, actually. So there was it wasn't just one-way traffic. It was very much people coming into this country as well, exploring, and certainly it was very much a case of the American market was very, very, very key, and certainly people picked up on it because railways got you there fast. And in tandem with this, you had this whole idea that certain people, certain classes of people, particularly the upper middle classes and the aristocracy, were very keen to highlight their position in life, and increasingly, I think, decadent places to stay, restaurants, eateries, and concepts around the luxury floating palaces of the transatlantic liners and trains were on the drawing boards. Architects drawing boards mirrored society segregation at the time, very, very much so.
And something that strikes me about this period is also there's the sort of aspirational dimension for people who are sort of like something really interesting. There's an interesting article about railway clerks I read, and by Peter Scott. He's talking about how people would spend a lot of money. Clerical staff would spend so much money that they would have less disposable income than lower paid people, but because they had this sort of sense of, I have to spend to keep up appearances, to travel second class, So there's a sort of aspirational keeping up appearances dimension.
I think there's a certain degree of that, David. Yeah, very, very much so. I certainly think the Edwardian period was probably the age of of traveling elegance, which mirrored society as a whole. You had the best fine dining restaurants, grand hotel establishments, and basically it was almost like an arms race in railway catering at the time. Everyone was keen to get in on the act to some extent.
Well, indeed.
I guess keeping up with the Joneses really was par for the course in some ways.
Well, indeed. Right. Let's move on.
Yeah.
If that's okay with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, number of new titles targeting upscale readers. So that's before we go on to this. Gunnar has asked something about is there anything about the Bradshaw guides?
Well, certainly Bradshaw guides were very well developed by that stage, and there were other people entering the marketplace, Baedeker's guides as well. It wasn't just purely Bradshaw, but I think by the turn of the 20th century, travel writing, travel guides were very sophisticated affairs, which were, driving a lot of tourists at the time. So, and I think also that fed into the idea that people in publishing or people connected with publishing newspapers saw great opportunities. And I think from the 1890s onwards, there was a significant profusion in the number of new titles targeting prosperous upscale readers. And very, very significant was the amount of space given over to a female audience. Certainly the development of the illustrated weeklies was particularly strong in that period in time. And you had complete sections almost devoted to the female audience, particularly such as fashion increasingly became a major aspect. And I developed a nice little travel blog for Mary Evans' picture library, actually, which was very much about the travelling in style and some of the things that were developing very much on that front, which all dovetail into this. Certainly at the time, you had specialist women's weeklies that were introduced, such as the Lady and Vanity Fair. And I guess from a travel planning perspective, I describe it as the lady in the household was beginning to have a significant impact on travel plans, which railway companies did recognise, because the lady in the household was impacting in the way travel decisions were being made, where to travel, at what time, and particularly the composition. So the size of the audience travelling might well increase significantly. So if it was for holidays, it might be husband, wife, children, domestic staff. So it was quite possible that railway companies, for every household, they might be selling 6 or 7 tickets on that basis. So the railway companies did respond to that, and they recognised that particular opportunity at the time.
Do we know if the railway companies were advertising in these magazines at all?
Oh yes, very, very much so. Certainly by around about 1895, the railway notices sections at the reverse of the publications, you would find a lot of display advertising fitting around the women's sections, and very, very much so that the railway companies were very much in competition with each other at the time. And certainly for key points in the calendar, Easter, Whitsun, holidays, the summer holidays themselves, and of course at Christmas, it was very much a competition time, and each of the railway companies, the pre-grouping railway companies, were almost falling over themselves to get the best stories forward. And certainly from the late Victorian period, that is where you started getting this interaction between publishers and the railway companies, where they were recognising, railway companies were saying, well, yes, we're placing a lot of advertising, and for the first time that the publishers were responding and developing stories around travel per se as a whole. So it was the first point in time where you could see lots of collaborative efforts beginning to evolve.
Excellent. Really interesting. Railway carriages. So, the key element, really. What?
Yeah. Well, I guess as I've just touched upon earlier, we saw major developments coming from the 1870s onwards. I guess that was a combination of what Midland Railway were doing, introducing major new developments, which naturally saw significant opportunities, which everyone dovetailed into. But I think it was very much a case of it all didn't happen at one time. There were stages in development of railway carriages that came on the back of different sort of developments. Certainly the flat packs that were brought in by Midland Railway, the Pullman drawing cars, the bogie cars, the bogie carriages provided much more comfort, more spacious, better facilities, and in tandem with this, you had ultimately the development of gangway car to connected stock with their own compartments. This provided the space. Lavatories became the norm, certainly for first-class passengers. That increasingly became the norm, and on the back of that, you had the ability. I think one of the key aspects about that was fresh water supplies that were built into carriage construction. Fresh water supplies provided the means to flush away waste products in loos, but more importantly, it provided the development of dining carriages, dining cars, and food preparation areas in a much more robust way. Certainly from the early 1800s onwards, dining cars became a regular feature of most expresses, really, to be quite honest. But it was a combination of these things that were, I guess, were totally in isolation, but they sort of, the combination, the sum of the whole, were very, very important.
I mean, so one of my favourite images is of the Midlands, because the Midlands sort of one that came over from the Pullman Company from the United States in the 1870s had the cooking area out on the back on a platform that was open to the elements.
Yeah,
I just thought that was amazing. But to what extent do you think the companies are sort of in a arms race to get the best trains or get the best facilities on the trains? And
I think that didn't register strongly until the 1880s. Certainly, as I've alluded to, the Great Northern Railway on the East Coast Consortium were very loath to invest in new stock up until basically market development started pushing them down that particular route. And over the years, the East Coast Consortium developed some of the best carriage stock, certainly by the Flying Scotchman era prior to the First World War. They had some of the best carriages around, actually. But it was very much a case of, I guess, Pullman's developments with the London-Brighton South Coast Railway. At the time, there was some experimentation with the London South Western Railway, with Pullman cars going west to Bournemouth. Certainly, later, obviously, you had the development of Pullman with on the southeast coast Chatham line, SECR. But I think Pullman's developments were very much in tandem with the LBCR on the London-Brighton run, very much in the 1890s onwards. There were significant developments on that. Likewise with what Midland Railway were doing. And I think there was a kind of a drag effect which pulled the rest of the companies along with them, actually. Certainly, I think by the late 1880s, London North Western Railway had woken up to the opportunities, certainly on the West Coast line. And I think, what they developed over the next 20 years is basically written into railway folklore in many ways. Likewise, I guess, similarly, the Great Western Railway were a little bit late in developing similar opportunities to the West Country. But I guess to some extent they had to get over the familiarisation, the standardisation from broad gauge to 4 foot 8.5 inches throughout the railway system. But thereafter, I think the Great Western Railway recognised great opportunities that were happening, and I think for GWR's perspective, there were the huge numbers of American tourists that were travelling east from New York, Boston, across the North Atlantic, not just to Liverpool, where obviously the White Star Line and Cunard had their base at the time, but also you had from 1892 with London South Western developing Southampton as a port, very much in tandem with the American line, their quartet of big liners that were some of the best on the North Atlantic run. And these ships, likewise with similarly with the German lines, Hapag and North NDL, were very much stopping at Plymouth en route coming over here. So the Great Western Railway, certainly on the back of ocean mail business, picked up on the opportunity to ratchet in on prosperous American visitors who were keen to get off the train, off the ship, particularly if it was a rough railway, a rough sea crossing, and get to London at the earliest opportunity. So a lot of that was happening at the same time. It was very, very much an interesting development where both shipping lines and railway companies beginning to work very, very close together for the first time. And of course, I was just going to say, from the LNWR's perspective, there was very much a close interlocking relationship between people like the White Star Line, Cunard, in terms of overlooking directorships between railway companies and shipping lines at the time, which was one of the key features of, I guess, the expansion of the luxury sector in many ways.
I mean, my favourite one of those is Viscount Pirrie, who was on the Southwestern board. He was on the White Star board, and he was, of course, chairman of Harland and Wolff. So he had that sort of link between the three, because, of course, the White Star moved to Southampton in 1907, 8.
Yeah.
So that it's interesting. I mean, there needs to be more work on how these directors facilitated coordination between different industries. So,
I think by late Victorian times, it was a closely coordinated industry that certainly, if you take GWR as an example, they had a real eye on the North American market, and their historic landscape books introduced, travel booklets introduced in 1904, were very much centred on the American pilgrim market, and they were absolutely keen to get in on that market to some extent. And likewise at the time, London South Western Railway were developing links themselves, very much on the interrelationship with American Line and the development of the Stonehouse operation in Plymouth. So basically LSWR up until 1910 were very much competing for those American passengers wanting to get off at the first opportunity.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, so we talked about a lot of that. So yes, is there anything you particularly want to?
I think one of the interesting aspects was high quality dining cars really became the norm from the 1890s onwards. A lot of effort was put into the development of dining cars, not just the first class dining experience, but very, 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 very much so with the quality of the third class dining car provision. And certainly, I guess from that period onwards, a lot of people noticed the quality of the third class dining experience. And in fact, some of the railways, such as the Glasgow South Western Railway, their third class provision was noted as being almost as good as the first. And people like American novelist Stephen Crane were suggesting to American travellers, come across the Atlantic second class and then get on the train and eat and drink third class. That was being pushed. As a.
I mean, interestingly, you've touched on something Phil asked. Did famous novelists and their books have an impact on luxury travel?
Yeah, very, very much so. I think that increasingly became travel writing gained a significant foothold at this period in time, and certainly people like Mark Twain, Wendell Holmes talked about this in many ways, that their experience of travelling in Britain and on the continent to some extent was very much talked about in their writings, which fostered an interest in the in American audiences.
Excellent. I'll head on to, because I'm realising the time is pressing. So there we have the Flying Scotchman near Hatfield.
Yeah. I put that particular example in because of the development of clerestory stock, particularly in the 1890s. The raised centre profile allowed more lighting, natural lighting to come in. Particularly, I guess it was until 1894 that the dynamos attached to bogies allowed better lighting within carriages. So the clerestory carriage was an important aspect of letting more light in. Also, the wearing of the top hat was obligatory to many in the upper classes at the time. So the extra height provided the opportunity down the centre gangway to some extent. So all of this was quite profound. Certainly on the East Coast, clerestory carriages were the norm, very much so on Great Western Railway to some extent. But other railway companies by the late 1890s were moving to the elliptical shaped carriage, and some of the developments, because certainly from a Pullman's perspective, since the acquisition of Desire in 1907, it was now no longer a case of flat-packed IKEA carriages. It was very much that them being developed at the great places in this country, the great carriage works.
Yeah. I'm just picking... What year is this image? Do you know, Martyn?
I think that is around 1895, I believe.
So one of my interesting things that I occasionally like to post is that Flying Scotsman, the other one, there is a postcard that the London North Western Railway released in, I think, about 1906, 7, 8. That actually has Flying Scotsman on one of their trains, and it's just interesting how other companies were using that name and appropriating it before it was sort of formalised later on.
Well, I think so, actually. I mean, the Scotchman was used by the East Coast Consortia. That eventually morphed into the Flying Scotchman as speedier train service is developed with better signalling and braking systems, which allowed the facilitation of faster runs. And likewise with the development of bogie carriages. The whole thing ran in tandem, and certainly by the 1890s, that you had the development of 440 Atlantic class and 460 Atlantic class specification locomotives, which really started to speed the proceedings up on particularly Anglo-Scottish routes.
Cool. So should we head to, because I'm conscious of the time.
Absolutely. I think to some extent we've touched around some of the ideas of destinations and place branding, but certainly by the turn of the 20th century, the early 1900s, I guess railway companies were really the original destination marketeurs in this country. And certainly I know from some of your research in North Wales and some of the work I'd looked at down in Devon and Cornwall, railways started working very, very closely and collaborating with a whole host of different partners. And this included local and municipal authorities, private sector partners, not just hospitality on that. If railway companies weren't building their own hotels, they were very, very much involved in the creation and development of other people and other partners on that. So they were very, very much so. I mean, certainly the Great Western Railway by the turn of the 20th century were putting huge overtures into Ireland. Killaloe, they financed an expansion of the Killaloe Hotel there with another 40 rooms, and that was in tandem with the embryonic Irish Tourist Association. So a lot was going on at that time. So, and very much so targeting affluent visitors. So it was very much a case of the right destinations, having the right amenities, having the right product attributes. So it was very much about creating the right kind of products, golf destinations, spa, coastal and seaside resorts. They all intermingled, and it was fairly clear that railway companies were beginning to cast a wider perspective on where their customers were coming from, not just this very small cohort of aristocracy, but this very, very much larger, prosperous middle class grouping.
I mean, this is the period where you start sort of from the round 1900 to get sort of much more professionalism in the marketing side of the business, with the establishment of departments and advertising professionals more broadly in the economy. You get like advertising periodicals.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So do you think? I mean, yeah. I'll let you.
Well, I think at the time the railway companies had well-established publicity functions. We would now call it a marketing department, marketing function, but in the early 20th century it was publicity functions, and it was increasingly dovetailed into the very senior echelons of the railway company operations. You know, it was publicity departments were a stone's throw away from the CEOs, the general managers' offices. So they become absolutely important and pivotal organisations in the development of posters, pamphlets, brochures, tourist guides, and timetables, basically to entice prosperous customers. So it became big business, and certainly from the early 20th century, international marketing perspectives really registered strongly. So not just the Great Western Railway, London North Western Railway, and the LSWR to some extent were casting eyes on the American Pilgrim, and they were very, very keen to ratchet and develop that marketplace.
Yeah. I think one of the things, if we take a slightly longer view than we're looking at today, it's one of the things that struck me in looking at the internal LNER files over the last couple of years is how very much the sort of head of the advertising publicity department, whatever they called it, becomes more and more significant in conversations around policy up to 1939. I think that's a shift that emerges and evolves over time as those functions become more important.
I think they did. I guess certainly some of the railway companies, particularly the Great Western, they were. I guess they were probably the first railway company to segment their audiences, their customer base in a more systematic way. They had a very good understanding where their customer base was, where they were coming from, where the prosperous passengers were doing, and likewise they were fine-tuning their marketing communications to cater for those particular audiences. We talked about earlier the emergence of specialist publications from the 1890s onwards, and it was very much a case of dovetailing and developing that very, very, very strongly at the time. So, as you say, systematically, the railway the railway publicity departments became much more sophisticated armories, and certainly from the early days of the Southern Railway post 1923, the dark arts of journalism entered with the Southern Railway and the development of what we now describe as public relations.
Okay, so let's yes, the Southern Bell.
Yeah, let's just briefly touch about what was going on in that period of time. Well, certainly by the Edwardian era, LBSCR's Southern Belle was being described as the most luxurious train in the world. Um, there were really high class ways of travelling by train at that period of time, certainly on the shorter routes as well as on the longer routes. Certainly by, I think it was the end of 1914, you had a new generation of consortia stock on both the East Coast line and the West Coast line, and they really, really brought some of the most prestigious railway carriages to the fore. Certainly, I think from the 1890s onwards, you had a new generation of royal trains, which the Great Western and the East and West Coast consortia were very, very much involved with. And this sort of fueled the expansion of developments in deluxe railway travel, really, at the time. And I guess railway companies were doing their own thing. Likewise, the Pullman Company was doing their own thing. They were expanding their penetration beyond the Brighton Company into the SECR with dedicated Pullman boat trains on from London to Dover. So all that was happening at the time. And it was very much a case, I think, that the Pullman Company for the first time was being registered in the same breath as luxury railway travel. It was, I guess, some of the developments going on with the Pullman Car Company coming under British ownership, and which saw significant developments. Obviously, on the Caledonian Railway, by 1913, there was a huge number of new carriages that were going to be built over. Didn't happen because of the First World War got in the way. So there were massive developments that were going on. Likewise, Pullman Company was, because of, again, family connections, were very much linking into developments with Wagon Lee on the continental side. Certainly, the British companies operating services across the Channel to France, particularly to Dover, from Dover to Calais and Boulogne. This was all beginning to develop very, very significantly. So it was a combination of Nord, PLM, and Wagon Lee all acting together. And we were talking about this development of systematic planned marketing activities. Certainly by the early 20th century, this was very, very much working hand in plate with developments that were going on in France and Belgium and across the Channel at the time. So traveling to Paris, to the French Riviera, part of the Riviera season, was very, very much into this coordinated activity that was very much going on. And certainly Wagon Lee were providing the most exquisite carriages to travel on. The sleeping cars from Calais, Boulogne southwards were going directly to the French Riviera at the time. So, and this developed very significantly. I think by 1899, Wagon Lee had 21 separate services they were operating on the continent. So it was significant, very significant.
Okay. Did British companies... so Gunnar's asked a question. Did British companies actually make money, or was it a lost leader to promote their service standards?
Well, I guess the jury's out on this in many ways. Certainly railway catering, that question has come up many a time. But generally catering was just one aspect of the overall equation. I guess, I mean, notwithstanding, was an important part, but certainly railway catering became much more integral to the railway company's operation. Whether it actually made money is a moot point, but whether it was treated as a loss leader, certainly. A number of the American companies at the time, it was very much viewed as a lost leader, whereas in this country and on the continent, it was very much more integrated into the total product offer. So I guess it was synonymous with the total experience that was being provided at the time. So I guess it was very difficult to extricate the dining section of it, but I guess to some extent railway companies at this time were probably at the most profitable point. So I guess it's impossible to unravel the data really, but I guess that some money was being made from the catering side of things as part and parcel of the overall offer.
Although I will say that there are concerns around this time. The literature is sort of talking about profitability of companies, and that's been a big discussion. And how it's one of the most profitable periods, the sort of 1870 to 1914. But there is a gradual decline. I'm not convinced by this argument, but people have argued in the past that actually the service standards of rolling stock actually increased capital, diminished the dividend. It's open debate, but there's still a sort of sense that there's still, some of them are 40% of their revenue goes in profit. So, it's profit. So I don't know. That's an open question. I think I argued against it in my thesis, that it was a massive drop. I can't remember. That was a while back.
I guess to some extent it was also competition, particularly on the routes north. There was only a finite customer base, and that was being fought upon by different railway companies, and there's only a certain proportion of that feeding into the overall equation. I think one of the interesting aspects, if we alluded to earlier, was the grouse season in Scotland. Certainly by the 1890s, it was very, very much a case of at Inverness, you had both the you had West Coast dining cars, sleeping car trains coming in, East Coast as well as that of the Midland. They were all bunched together. So there was competition, and I guess that really eroded a lot of the potential profitability at the time.
Okay, so we've only got a couple more slides.
But I think we touched on the value of the American tourist in previous discussions on this, and certainly from a carriage development perspective, the American boat trains were being systematically developed for the American visitor marketplace. They become the equivalent of floating palaces on wheels at the time, and very much catering for the American customer base, which was certainly by the turn of the 20th century was very, very significant. I think if we move on to the last slide, it's interrelated to the whole luxury experience, travel experience, very much linked into the development of grand hotels. The Ritz, such as were very much based on the American model, and became very much a feature of city centre landscapes, London, Paris, Berlin to a lesser extent, and certainly the French Riviera, the Italian Riviera, and in Italy. These places were absolutely instrumental. It's very, very difficult to put specific data around this, but I've managed to pick up some value as to how many Americans were in this country at the time. By 1910, it was estimated 80,000 Americans were estimated to be either living or on extended visits to London, Paris, and Berlin. Concurrent with this, by the early 20th century, some 80% of travellers coming off the floating palace steamers returning to New York were Americans. So this excluded the emigrants segment completely. So it was very, very, very significant at that time. The British media described it as an American army of invasion. And at the prior to the First World War, where our story basically ends, some estimates put the value of the US traveller market at some 150,000 of them arriving annually. So it was very, very, very significant. And I just wanted to pick up on a piece of something. An American writer, Blanche McManus, observed that many of these changes that were going on were particularly there was an English demand for comfort, but she says it was the Americans who actually demanded luxury. Mellon and Munson, in their book on continental travel, that they picked up on this as well. But Blanche McManus's book, The American Woman Abroad, written in 1911, she writes about how London and Paris, the cityscapes and the hotels were being developed for her fellow countrymen. And she says, she actually writes, the lavish, convenient American way of living has had much to do with the change that has come over the European caterer to the foreigner. Now that he has learned the trick, he is working on his own account, adapting it to the needs, even though the pace be slow. It is still evident that it's come as a result of a first desire to please an American clientele. The patriotic Frenchman dramatically points to the big hotels which have gone up in Paris during the last few years and exclaims, "It is for you Americans that these luxurious establishments are being built. It is you who are coming here in our midst and demoralizing our own people with your dollars." So I think that was a very, very interesting way of describing some of the things that were going on here. And certainly, if you talk about things that were also things to do that apart from travelling on the railways, retail and shopping culture was becoming more pervasive. Special shopping malls and arcades were built around prosperous districts of London and major cities. And I guess one particular thing I picked up on was in 1907, Carriage arranged to price everything in their windows, both in sterling and in dollars, in view of the large influx of US visitors expected for the summer season. So I think that just about sums it up, really. Yeah. That's some of the things that were going on at the end of the Edwardian era. Very much a complicated, nothing you can put together specifically saying it's this or that, but it was part of a very, very interesting period in time when a lot of things came together, I think, and the railway companies were very much in the forefront of this development.
Yeah. Okay, so we got a couple of these are just favourite posters of your own, or?
I guess actually, I love this one of Bournemouth and the Chimes. This was believe this was from 1916 actually, and it was, and again, it's an example of how the municipal authorities got involved with travel and tourism in a more systematic way, and certainly what was going on in Bournemouth at the time was absolutely instrumental. You basically alluded to the fact the LSR made Bournemouth, but I think certainly by the 1890s onwards, as key people in the hospitality industry in Bournemouth. Bournemouth, for instance, had five-star hotels up until the First World War. So it was these people gradually represented themselves onto municipal authorities, and they were movers and shakers in the way things developed. And I think this was a particularly good example of the way Bournemouth Municipal Corporation and the LSR worked in creating place marketing exercises at the time.
Yeah, it's interesting that the illustrated guide is available from the town clerk, not the railway company.
Yes.
But one of the things that strikes me about it is how it's thinking about work that's been done is how it's an ideal, very much idealized, uncontested place. The beaches are quite clear. I imagine they would not be on a busy summer busy summer day. It's idyllic. There's no one around. It's presenting an image that didn't really accord with a reality that you might see from this view.
Well, actually, to some extent, you're probably looking at a view of that from Malham China's progressively the valley, the wooded valleys west of Bournemouth as you move towards Poole. They were always less populated to a certain extent, much more prosperous areas beyond the immediate pier approaches on there. Certainly by the late Victorian, the Edwardian period, the pier approaches there were very, very much overrun by tourists and day trippers to some extent. You had the pleasure steamers coming up alongside. But certainly, as you progressively went westwards along the Chines towards Poole and what is now Sandbanks, and likewise, similarly, as you went beyond the other pier at Boscombe into towards Christchurch, you had again much more prosperous areas that were less frequented by the visitor. And yes, to some extent it was a stylized and idyllic representation, but they were not so heavily populated. And this continues to be the same days. I mean, the end of lockdown, you had all these photographs and pictures of Bournemouth being overrun by people, desperate to get to the beach and everything else. But a couple of miles east towards Southbourne, likewise towards the Chines, before you got to Sandbanks, which again was heavily overpopulated. These areas are, even now, are not so many tourists there.
Yeah. Okay.
You can find your own little spot.
We'll quickly run over this one.
I love this particular execution of Turnberry. I'm very, very interested in the developments that were going on in Scotland and the developments of golf tourism towards the end of the Victorian era and particularly into the Edwardian period. Certainly, this is the development of Turnberry at I guess that is around the early Edwardian period. Yeah. Likewise, Glen Eagles was very much on the designing blocks of the Caledonian Railway by 1910, and golf started to progressively become part of the upscale tourist package in the Edwardian era, attracting high value clientele, not just from this country, but again Americans in their droves were playing golf, and golf specials, as well as the grouse specials were part and parcel of this development at the time. So golf tourism was another feature of this embryonic luxury travel industry, which the railway companies promoted it to a great extent.
Yeah. So that's our last slide, everybody. We do have one question that we'll have to answer very quickly from Phil. Where is the future of luxury railway travel, more or less?
I think we have now a number of key players in the world with a whole series of different luxury travel experiences in different countries. I think at the moment there is room for growth at the moment. Belmont, obviously the largest provider in the world in this marketplace. Similarly, I guess Golden Eagle luxury trains with their several offers, and in different parts of the world you have different developments that are going on. You've got this in Japan, you've got this in Australia. So I think there is still significant capacity. Likewise in South America, in Peru, there are Ecuador, there are various developments going on. And I guess if you've watched a lot of television railway programs over the last couple of years, the luxury railway sector has been, quite furnished, actually, to be quite honest. So I think there will be more, undoubtedly, more routes, more experiences provided. But the level to what that is, I don't honestly know, actually.
Well,
it'll be very interesting
to
see where we go.
We'll see what happens, yeah. So, I think we should get the book up. There is your 2 covers of your book and your forthcoming. When's the second one coming out, Martyn?
The second one, Boat Trains, will be at the end of October, early November, published by Pen and Sword. So it's on their website now. Forward bookings, forward orders are being taken. Luxury Railway Travel is out. Obviously, it was published last autumn.
There's
so,
my copy.
Yep, absolutely, yeah.
So I put a link to where you can buy Martyn's books and pre-order Boat Trains in the show notes. So if you just look on the YouTube page, it should be there. You might need to refresh it because I popped it in a bit late. So thank you, Martyn. I'll come back to you in a second, but first a few things to say. We are now thinking about the MA in Railway Studies again. 3 years, totally online, cover all dimensions of railway history, cultural, social, economic, business, etc. We are going to open recruitment again in late September and it might be late September, it's likely late September, but it's possibly early October. And the reason I'm putting that up is because sadly this is the last Transport Tavern, and I just want to thank everybody who's come on. So Lynn, Erin, Gareth, Tim, Mike, Nicola, Susan, Martyn, David, Lewis, Kevin and Sophie, and it's been a real pleasure to do, and thank you to all my guests over the different weeks that this has been going on, and it's just been a joy to talk to people, and the videos hopefully will be here for a long time so you could go back and enjoy. But thank you everybody so much for coming on, and thank you all for tuning in and being part of this. And so I'm going to go back to Martyn and say thank you very much, Martyn. That was really excellent, really interesting, and everybody go out and buy the books. And so for a final time from me and from Martyn, goodbye.